So how much does it really cost to build 2 giant floor-to-ceiling walls of built-ins using IKEA components and some from scratch? Today we're gonna do just that in my parents' front guest bedroom. And you may think to yourself, hey, haven't I seen this girl do this before? And yes, you absolutely have, but that was a different bedroom and a different wall of IKEA built-ins. We're gonna switch things up this time, and I'm also gonna speed up the process by bringing in some help, because last time I did it all myself. This time my sister Brittany's coming to make sure I don't spend 3 months on this. So this entire wall is gonna be wardrobes, and this entire wall will be bookshelves. I'm actually gonna build the bookshelves from scratch this time, which will be interesting. So let's get into it. First step is adding in the platforms. I bought 2 sheets of CD plywood for this. CD is kind of a low-grade plywood. You don't have to have anything fancy because the platforms will be hidden later. I cut it into a couple different sizes of strips, one for the wardrobe wall and one for the custom bookshelves wall. Once I had them cut to width, then I cut them to length. And I always like to share my terrible drawings with you, just to remind you that you don't have to be an artist or know how to use fancy software in order to build beautiful things. This is my brad nailer to pin them in place, and then use screws to secure everything. In order for me to push the platforms up against the baseboards, I needed to remove the shoe molding. So I used my utility knife to break the caulk line and then pried it off. And you can tell that I'm an old home nerd because I thought that you would be interested in seeing these rusty brad nails I found to show how old they are. To me, it's interesting. Then I put the platform in place, and then the really tricky part started, leveling the platforms. You may think you can skip this step, but if you have any built-ins that have doors on them, if you don't level the bases first, the doors will not close properly and it will drive you insane. That was an unfortunate lesson that I had to learn in the last built-ins I did. So I just used shims everywhere to prop it up until it was level. And unfortunately, I learned that these floors actually dropped 2 inches in both directions across the room. And that would have been fine, but the problem is that once the built-ins got to the side of the wall, I had to prop them up so much that where the baseboard would hit is 2 inches higher than the baseboard on the wall, which is obviously not ideal because in order for these to look built in, the baseboards need to be at the same height everywhere. So I removed them, cut them down by 2 inches, brought them back in, re-leveled them, and thankfully that worked. So learn from my mistakes, folks. If you are building your own built-ins, make sure to measure the level of the floors first to see if there are any big rises and dips, and build your platforms based on that. For the 2 sheets of plywood and a pack of shims, this step cost me $78. Then it was time to assemble and install the IKEA cabinets. Except we didn't really have to assemble them because this room already had IKEA PAX cabinets in it, but we did have to disassemble them in order to pull out the cabinets we wanted to keep and sell the rest. Then we got the PAX cabinets that we wanted to keep in place and secured them together to the wall and to the base. But we forgot one thing.
What are we gonna do about the outlets that are behind the closets?
Yeah, we covered up the outlets, but thankfully with DIY, there's almost always a way to fix your mistakes. And in this case, we just did a little exploratory surgery with a drill, with the electricity off, of course. And we were able to find where the outlet was and make some strategic cuts in order to pull it out. Then I used an outlet extender to make sure it can safely extend into the built-ins, and then did the same fix for the other side. And with the outlet cover on, I think it just looks so nice. So for all these IKEA wardrobes we used, it would typically cost $670, but because we already had them in the room, it cost us $0. Then it was time for the really labor-intensive and expensive part of this room, building and installing the custom cabinets and bookcases. Now, if you have shorter ceilings, it's possible that you can just use the IKEA PAX wardrobes and they'll reach, but the ceilings in here are 12 feet tall, so we have to build custom cabinets to help them reach the top of the ceiling. To make them extra sturdy, we used 3/4 inch birch plywood, but to help them be a little lighter, we used 1/8 inch hardboard on the back. Everything you see in here is pretty much pocket hole construction, but we do attach the backs with just some regular screws. The trickiest part of these cabinets is getting them up in place because I feel like once assembled, they're probably around 60 pounds, which is a lot. So I was very happy to have Brittany here. She is super strong and made sure I didn't fall and die, which is always appreciated. Once we got them up and in place, I secured them to each other, to the wall, and to the cabinets below. Then it was time to tackle the other wall of floor-to-ceiling bookcases. But as I mentioned, these ceilings are 12 feet tall in here, and plywood only comes in 8-foot lengths. So I had to get a little crafty and got a dowel jig. I used the jig to drill holes for dowels in the size of the bookcases that I needed to attach together, and then filled the holes with glue and dowels, squished them together, and thankfully this worked to make super tall bookcase sides. And I always appreciate having a new tool to add to my woodworking collection. Once the sides were glued together, it was time to add a bunch of pocket holes. This is how we're constructing all the cabinets, all the bookcases, including their shelves. It just keeps things a little simpler, and with a giant build like this, I want it simple wherever I could get it. A little tip here for you if you're building bookcases and you want to make sure that each shelf is evenly spaced above each other. You can cut little spacer pieces of plywood and just move those spacer pieces bookcases between shelves in order to keep consistent spacing. The trickiest part for us with the bookcases was the racking, and by that I mean the bookcase wanted to lean to the side, which made adding on the back a little tricky. So what we'd have to do is have Brittany force the bookcases back level and hold them in place while I added on the backs. This was not ideal, and we learned later that what we should have done is add a diagonal piece of wood across the front that would hold the bookcase square and prevent the racking. This was also the point in the project when I started to realize that I had extremely bad food poisoning, which led me on a journey of the worst food poisoning in my life that lasted 7 days. But you know what? I continued to work on these built-ins even during it, which probably was a bad idea. But if anyone ever says that I am not a hard worker, I would like to point them to this video and mention that during most of this part, I had 100-degree fever. Okay, this part is super extra. You do not need to add this onto your built-ins. I had this weird little gap between the farthest bookcase and the wall. And because I hate wasted space and I love extra organization, I bought these 2 little cabinet pullouts, and typically these would be used for spices and kitchens and that sort of thing, but I thought, why not add them to these built-ins? Extra storage is always a yes for me. Install is pretty simple, and it's much simpler when you're not starting to hallucinate from fever. So we got both of these drawers installed on this skinny little bookshelf, but before we slid it in place, I also added in some pieces of plywood to the wall to allow me something to nail trim into later to fill in the gaps between the bookcases and the wall. Then we got this final bookcase in place, secured them to each other, to the bases, to the walls, you know the drill, and then we got started on the cabinets to fill in the gaps. But these are the ones that go above the window, so there's nothing for them to sit on when we're installing them. So to help with that, I installed some boards up here that we could slide them onto just by screwing them in level to the adjacent cabinets and using my jigsaw to cut off the excess. And from there I could secure them to the adjacent cabinets and the back wall. But because I'm also very paranoid about these falling on someone's head as they're sitting on the window seat, I also added in some extra supports to the top of the cabinet and the ceiling above. The extra bookcase for the other wall was a lot simpler, a lot lighter, and we're able to do the same supports to protect it from falling. The final pieces of these built-ins were the window seats. Again, same thing as before, using lots of pocket holes, and in this case, it's 5 sides of 3/4 inch plywood. Because I don't like to just make any kind of window seat, I want this to be extra storage, so it's a super sturdy storage chest. Then I slid it in place, secured it to the sides, and then I added a few stretcher pieces of plywood to the back and to the sides to allow the lid something to rest on. Then finally, I added some trim to the top to make everything nice and flush, and you'll see later how the lid will fit in here. So that was the end of all the custom cabinets and bookcases. It actually took me 13 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood and a bunch of sheets of the other sizes, so it cost me a total of $1,754. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's actually not that much more than it costs for the IKEA components in these single wall built-ins. I'm going to do a full video comparing IKEA bookcases to the DIY bookcases I built and cost comparisons between the two. The next step was trimming out the built-ins, and this is the part that actually makes all these different components look built in. In other words, like they're an existing part of the room. And in order to do that, the bottom trim and the top trim have to match, and everything needs to feel interconnected. So I got started by installing the baseboards, and I added some shoe molding to the top and the bottom to match the trim and the rest of the room. Do you see how this starts to make all these built-ins look as if they're connected to the rest of the room? That's the goal with all the trim in here. Keeping that in mind, I also need a way for these built-ins to have the same crown molding as the rest of the room. So I started by installing this 2x4 to the top to allow me something to nail into. And I just used wood glue and some brad nails to secure it. I also added it as blocking for this big space on the side, again, just to allow me something to nail the trim into. Then, just like in the last bedroom, I used my router with a chamfer bit to create this nice edge on some plywood, and then used my brad nailer to secure it to that 2x4 above. And that closes up the gap enough so that I can secure the crown molding to it later. Speaking of filling up gaps, I also need to hide all these cracks between the different pieces of the bookcases that I stuck together. And once this is caulked, no one will know that these seams are there. I also covered up the seam between the custom cabinets and the IKEA wardrobes below, and then I got started on one of my favorite parts, which is paneling the fronts of the window seats. And then to do a little more visual balancing, I also decided to add in a little ledge above this window on the bookcase side, just to even out the spacing around the window. Then to fill in the seams on the side of the window seats, I thought I would just add in some simple trim, but then I got really excited about the idea of adding beveled paneling that matched all the doors. To create this beveled paneling, I just took some 1/2 inch plywood and ran it through my table saw at a 45-degree bevel, and that created these perfect beveled boards that I could pop in place and create this pattern. I also fixed one of the eyesores in the room, which was this sagging bottom on this giant cabinet that went above this window. This was one of the trickiest parts of this build, is figuring out what to do in the corner where the wardrobe meets the bookcases. So I had to get a little crafty. And what I ended up doing was creating these false door fronts and attaching them to this little sliver of bookcase. And then I paneled them to look like the doors themselves. I also had to fill in a lot of weird wonky gaps between the walls and the components. So I would scribe a crazy line on a piece of wood and then free cut it with my saw and then go back and pop it in place, which is kind of an annoying process, but it is also really nice to see all these giant seams closed up. And then went around the room filling all these little funky gaps, including this crazy little corner here where the wardrobes meet the bookcases. bookcases. I did a lot of cobbling with trim in order to make this look seamless, but I think I did a pretty good job. The final step for trim here is cleaning up the fronts of the bookcase plywood because those exposed plywood edges are not that pretty. So I just used some long strips of poplar and nailed them in place. And that was finally the end of the trim. The cost to trim out the built-ins was about $400. Then we have to get to the IKEA doors. So in addition to the doors that are going on the wardrobes themselves, I also needed short doors to go on the custom cabinets up top and on the bottoms of the bookcases. Rather than try to match the IKEA doors perfectly, I just bought extra IKEA doors and then trimmed them down to size. The only thing you have to do here is then drill a new hole for the hinge and fill and sand the old hinge holes that you no longer need. So if you're painting IKEA built-ins, you have to use this crazy, stinky, expensive primer. And I did that last time, but I feel like I didn't apply a thick enough coat. So this time I wanted to try something a little bit different and use spray paint instead because spray paint can stick to plastic and everything else. So I figured, why not IKEA doors? And I am proud to report that this actually worked extremely well, but we did run out of this blue color of spray paint and we ended up using a few different colors. So they look a little bit crazy. Please do not judge them too harshly. They will not stay this color. I was able to use these IKEA doors for almost everything except the top cabinet above the big window. So for that one, I cobbled together some scraps to make it have the same beveled appearance as the IKEA doors. Then I got all the doors fitted in place. I just wanted to make sure everything fit, and I also just wanted to look at everything come together for the first time, which was very exciting for me. This step with the IKEA doors cost me $627. After all that hard work, it's finally time for the fun part, which is paint. But before we can get to that, we have to do lots of annoying prep work. It is important. It is sad, but it's important. And that includes filling every single nail hole and crevice and exposed plywood edge, and there are a lot of them in here, and then sanding that smooth, and then caulking every remaining gap and crack. And with bookcases, there are lots of them. But it's satisfying, and it's also nice to see all these gaps and cracks close up so perfectly. After doing all of this work and all of this prep work, I just could not bring myself to hand paint everything. So instead of the many hours of hand painting that would be ahead of me, we decided to just invest a couple hours in prepping the room for spraying. Once everything was protected, I protected myself in my giant little spacesuit and then got to work spraying. And I landed on this really beautiful color of gray. It's kind of like this dove gray. It changes a little bit in different lights. I just think it's really calming and soothing. And when guests come, they'll be able to really enjoy this beautiful gray room. Yeah, just kidding. This is just the primer. I'm kind of allergic to neutrals, so we are definitely going with another color in here. Before I can spray the actual paint on, we had to again do more prep work by lightly sanding all of the old primer coat and removing any dust. Then it was finally time to spray the paint. And it's this beautiful light blue color, and as it goes on, you may think like, wow, that doesn't look that much different from the gray. Wait till it's dry. Wet and dry paint always look different. But I did spray 2 full coats in here. We also set up this pop-up spray tent outside, which was so nice for the doors. And then I just brought the sprayer outside to give them that airbrush finish. And just look at that beautiful, smooth, perfect finish. That's what makes spraying worth it. Then I removed all the masking, and this is the fun part when I got to really see all these colors come together and the light shine through the windows again. And I don't know about you, but someone needs to have a channel just for peeling paint tape because I find this so satisfying. And here is what the paint color looks like when it's dry. Such a pretty calming blue, but we did have to go through a ton of paint to cover all these surfaces twice. So this step cost me $450. I also used that same paint to paint the old crown molding, and thankfully I just reused this from before and didn't have to buy anything new. And I misplaced my coping saw somewhere and tried to use my Japanese saw to do some coping, and I would not recommend it. It was pretty awful. We got the crown molding in place, and no, I will not be giving a DIY tutorial of how to install crown molding because I'm actually pretty bad at it. But I am pretty good at disguising my bad install from 12 feet in the air. And with Brittany here to help, I was also able to finally install this giant door up top. I added in the storage chest lids, and then it was time for hardware. For these lids, I like to use these solid brass hinges here. And for the little pullouts on the side of the bookcases, I wanted them to feel like a little bit of a secret treasure. So rather than have them match the brass knobs on the rest of the doors, I decided to paint these wood knobs so that it blends in a little bit. For the brass knobs, I just like to age them a little bit, so I put them in some brass ager, and you can see them go from a shiny gold to a beautiful dark burnished brass. This step cost me about $50, which brings the grand total of these 2 walls of floor-to-ceiling built-ins with IKEA wardrobes and custom-built bookcases to $3,359. So what do you think? Was it worth it? Honestly, I think it's a pretty good deal. There is so much more storage in here, and it adds so much character to the home. It completely transforms this room, and I want to steal it and put it in my own house. But guys, we're not even done in here. I still have many things to finish in this room, so be on the lookout for the full bedroom makeover reveal, hopefully coming very soon.
First. Oh, okay. How are we doing